major topics, as you can imagine from the title. We'll begin by looking at both exclusion and limitation clauses, and I'll explain more detail with regard to that on the next slide in a moment. And then we'll move on to talk about endeavours clauses. So I'm sure we're all familiar with those wonderful phrases of best endeavours, reasonable endeavours, and of course the notoriously difficult to nail down all reasonable endeavours. We will look at some recent case law on this, one in particular that deals with the issue of all reasonable endeavours, and we'll also look at when we should use best and reasonable in practice. And finally, we'll look at termination clauses, something that's often overlooked, and in fact, often something that lawyers can make a bit of a mess of, because they have a tendency just to cut and paste what they used last time and hope for the best. We will see there are a variety of permutations that exist that you need to be aware of, particularly with regard to break clauses and the sorts of language and scenarios that we can potentially construct with regard to those. So whether the customer knew or ought reasonably to have known of the existence and the extent of the term, having regard, among other things, to any custom of the trade and any previous course of dealing between the parties. Right. So essentially, what happens here is that in order for me to rely on this clause, in order for a court to rule that it is reasonable, I must have taken certain steps to bring it to the attention of the other party. So key things to note when we're drafting these clauses: think about the types of loss that are effectively not to be excluded, i.e. the things that would be void. Think about how much direct loss you are going to exclude. Obviously, we would expect an exclusion of indirect losses. We can exclude the implied terms of the Sale of Goods Act with one exception. However, we need to think about appropriate limitation amounts, and I would personally like to have separate clauses. So if the court does take out one of those clauses, hopefully the others would be unaffected in practice.